Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to get started with the final session. This will be the best session, last session of the day. I see you've all come in your own clothes. This is where we have the fun. You get the prize draw for the car for those people who aren't. We're not doing the car. Okay. So this is the fourth and final session of the day. You've been through crop establishment, nutrition, pesticides, herbicide, plant protection products. For those of you that don't know me, and not many of you will, I'm Sean Sparling. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Association of Independent Crop Consultants. I haven't got a big fancy slideshow for you, but I will tell you that 1 in 3 agronomists in the UK are independent agronomists and part of the AICC. And independent agronomy accounts for around 45% of UK farmland, so it's becoming more and more important, and I'm proud to be an independent agronomist. So why is an independent agronomist standing there talking about plant breeding? And that is down to community service, because I wouldn't pay the fine. That's why I'm here. It's not actually, because there are several pieces of legislation which are coming on board over the course of the next 2 or 3 years. One in particular, you'll have heard about the endocrine disruptors and the work that's being done in the EU and the EFSA and everything to do with the regulation of plant protection products. It is important, and it is related to plant breeding, because there's a piece called 1107/2009. The reason it's important is because we are potentially about to lose 60, 70, even 80% of the plant protection products we use. Therefore, the breeding and the varietal characteristics of wheat, it doesn't matter what it is, wheat, barley, rape, it doesn't matter, it becomes incredibly important on the list of priorities. Now, the reason things are about to change is because the EU are changing the way they look at registration from a hazard-based approach, which is a roller skate on the stairs, and the risk is whether you stand on the roller skate, to a risk-based system. In other words, they just ban the roller skates. And that's kind of where we're heading. Now, it's already more or less there in Denmark. They're working with around 60% of the products we use. They've seen a drop in yields. So the important thing from a plant breeding point of view is that we have to have good varieties. And we've got people like KWS. We've got a lot of plant breeders out there working to give us the best varieties, which will help us in the fight when we haven't got the plant protection products. So diseases and insecticides, all of these things become more important to us over the coming years. So if I could introduce you to your first speaker, because I can see you're all itching, and thank you for coming, it's nice to see you. And your first speaker this afternoon in the final session is Eric Ober, who's going to talk to you about wheat root morphology. And that's the importance of wheat root morphology, how much influence it plays in nutrient uptake and yield, and the role of plant breeding to ensure maximum exploitation of the yield potential of the varieties. And Eric is program leader in crop physiology within the genetics and breeding department at NIAB. He came from Rothamsted, and before that, the University of Missouri, Columbia in the USA. So Eric, if I could introduce you.
Thanks, Sean. Good afternoon, everyone. What I'd like to do in this session is talk about that part of the crop that we don't see, that significant portion of the root biomass or the crop biomass that is underground. But I think we all recognize that it is actually quite important. The title suggests that the roots actually are part of a way to achieve maximum profit and profitability, productivity in the crop. And I think there are ways that we can see how that can happen, not only from plant breeding, but also management of the crop and management of the soils. So what would a root system look like in a high-yielding, profitable crop? Well, this is what a root system of a wheat plant looks like when it's grown without any physical impediments in a very deep prairie soil. The root system just can grow and fill this whole soil volume all the way down 6 meters from the root surface. If you let that root system just continue to grow year after year, such as in a perennial wheat, then it can look like that. But of course, in our soils, in our crops, the root system doesn't quite look like that. The root architecture, the shape of the root system is very different in different crop species. And you can see winter wheat and maize and sugar beet all look different. There's different ways that the root system explores the soil volume. So there's different ways of actually looking at roots, and this is one way. You excavate a root system and then trace the roots manually by hand. And the last time anyone attempted to do this, good old John Weaver did that in 1926. But you can't really get away from that. Sooner or later, no matter how you look at roots and how you study them, you need to really see how they're performing in real field soils. And so 89 years later, we're still digging up roots and looking at them. But it's not a very fast method of looking at roots, and it's very laborious. So we look at other kinds of faster, cheaper, perhaps indirect ways of looking at roots and what they're doing in the soil. And one way that we've used is to measure the patterns of soil water extraction in different varieties of wheat under periods of drought or lack of rainfall. And this is an electronic soil moisture meter that's inserted into these plastic tubes that are installed in plots of different varieties of wheat. And then you can measure changes in the soil moisture as the crop extracts water from the soil. And this is the kind of pattern you get from the soil surface down to 1 meter 20, the soil moisture content. And then at different measurement periods, the soil water is extracted. And the difference between these different measurements can give you a rate of water removal from the soil, and that's shown in this plot. Again, from the soil surface down to 1 meter 20, rates of water uptake. So this is after about a month of soil drying, and you can see a lot of the moisture is already depleted in those upper soil layers. And the root system, in this example from Gladiator, the maximum rate of water use is occurring already at 80 centimeters from the soil surface. And then with each measurement a couple of weeks later, it moves further down into the soil profile as that moisture is depleted up in the upper layers. So these depths of where the maximum rates of water extraction are occurring can be plotted in this way, and we can compare the varieties. So this is the depth where that maximum rate of water extraction is occurring, and early in before flowering, the water is being extracted at 20-30 centimeters from the soil surface. Most of the water is extracted at that depth, and then as that water is depleted, the more water is extracted at deeper soil layers. This just shows an example where Xy19, for instance, is better able to get the root system in deeper soil layers earlier in grain fill compared with another variety like Rialto or Spark. So these are old varieties now, but it shows, first of all, that there's differences between the varieties in their ability to mine soil water, particularly in these deeper soil layers. And just another way of looking at this. So this is again the water uptake rate 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after flowering during a period of drought. And again, Xy19 shows this peak of water extraction between 80 and 100 centimeters from the soil surface. So really, depending on water deep in the subsoil, when a lot of that water in the upper part of the soil profile has already been depleted. And these varieties show a better ability to mine that deep water than some of the other varieties. So overall, this Xy19, for instance, is able to consume more of that water deep in the soil profile than Spark. And in fact, Xy19, not surprisingly, is also more drought tolerant than Spark in this example. So these two contrasting varieties are really a helpful tool, particularly for breeders. They can begin to say what is the genetic control of this behavior. Unfortunately, I think what we really need to move this work forward is even a larger contrast between varieties in order to take this forward genetically. But it shows an example of that there is this genetic variation for this important trait. So unfortunately, you don't always get something without paying for it, and this graph shows that there is probably a yield penalty for being able to putting lots of roots into the deep deeper soil layers. There's negative correlation between the yield potential of those lines and the water used under droughted conditions. However, if you look just at these lines that show pretty good yield potential, they don't differ very much in their yield potential, but they do differ in the amount of water used during that droughted period, a lot of which is taken from those deep soil layers. There's a difference of about 10 millimeters. So 10 millimeters doesn't really sound like a lot of water. But if you make the calculation, so a typical water use efficiency for a wheat crop is 20 kilos of grain per hectare per millimeter of water. So that extra 10 millimeters of water that some of these varieties can extract from the soil translate to 200 kilos of grain per hectare. So in a stressed crop, that can make a difference. So although the differences between the varieties are small, that extra bit of water can pay off. So water, of course, quite often people say, well, let's not cuddle the root system. If you want to have a deep root system, then you should stress the crop. So that will force the roots to grow deeper, and you'll have a better root system come drought. That's not quite true. It doesn't work that way, really. Basically, anytime you stress the crop, the roots are going to suffer as well. And this is just some old data that shows a very simple principle that, and this is an experiment with maize plants, but it applies to other crop species as well. Comparing with watered plants and unwatered plants, the root growth, whether it's the dry weight of roots or the total root length of roots, is much less in unwatered plants than compared with the watered plants. So root growth slows under drought-stressed conditions. But what does happen, though, is that the way that the root biomass is partitioned does seem to change, that under watered conditions, the deposition of root biomass over depth looks something like this, where you have most of the roots at this depth and less roots under stress conditions. But what you see then is there's more root biomass placed in these deeper layers. So at the expense of roots at this depth, there's more roots at this depth. So this plasticity of the root system actually is very important response to drying conditions. And this seems to be something that root systems do in a number of species. So we were looking at changes in soil moisture content with a soil moisture probe. But again, that's not really a very fast way of doing things, particularly on a breeding scale. So we were trying to see if we could use this electromagnetic induction method for measuring root activity in the field in different varieties. And this is the same bit of kit that you would use for soil mapping, but with a bit of tweaks to it and interpreting the data a little bit differently. We tried to see if we could measure differences in the soil water extraction in different varieties. And this is an example of some of the results. Now, lots of data here, but let me just point out a few of the key points from this result. First of all, we're comparing 4 contrasting varieties, a portion of what we did in this experiment. So Robigus and Zy19, those old varieties, a dwarf wheat, and High Star, a French hybrid. And so first of all, these are soil moisture contents from the surface down to a meter below the surface at these consecutive measurement dates. And the first result is that the difference between soil moisture content measured with a neutron probe, so a standard way of measuring soil moisture content, compared with this new method using the EMI conductivity measurements, shows very good agreement when the soils are still fairly moist. So that's a good sign that we're getting the same kind of result using that method versus the more laborious, time-consuming method of a neutron probe. And then you see that the soil moisture is getting, or rather the soils are getting drier as the crop is removing soil moisture. But in the drier soils, the agreement between these two methods starts to fall apart. So the method works well in moist soils, but not that well when the soils become quite dry. So the method still needs a little bit more development, but we think it has promise once we overcome some of those challenges. So another way of getting a handle on what's going on below the ground is to look at the crop. So you see these two contrasting varieties. They look pretty much the same to the eye, but when you measure them with a thermal camera, you see quite a different picture. So Paragon is a fairly cooler canopy compared with the French variety Apache, and that's because the crop is transpiring and evaporative cooling is keeping the canopy cooler, about 3 degrees cooler than in this crop. So the roots of Paragon are somehow able to extract more moisture and use that differently than in Apache. The other thing just to point out that you can't see when you're standing there at the plot with your naked eye is that there's a patch of take-all beginning to develop there. This hotter patch of crop is where the roots are suffering and the crop is not being supplied with sufficient moisture. So this very small difference you can pick up with a thermal image of the crop. So the root health as well, keeping root diseases under control, is another important component of this whole story. And this temperature of the canopy on a hot July day is way beyond the optimum for a wheat crop. So the other methods, if you don't like going in the field, you can cheat and grow them in these kinds of rhizotrons, which are useful if you want to have more controlled conditions, but you can't do things on a very large scale. You can do things on a large scale if you just look at seedlings. So this is a system set up at the University of Nottingham where they're growing wheat seedlings and measuring then things like root angle using a automatic photographic imaging system. So they can go through hundreds or thousands of lines automatically this way. So what is the value then of looking at this root angle? Well, one study in rice showed the advantage of that. So this is a popular upland variety of rice, but it has a very shallow root system. This is another landrace variety that has a very deep root system, but it doesn't yield quite as well. So the breeders crossed these in order to make a whole population of identical plants that differed only in this angle of the root system. And they were able to identify the portions of the genetic makeup of the plants that contributed to this particular trait. So a very wide angle of that root of the crown of the roots compared with a much steeper angle contributed to a yield advantage, particularly under dry conditions where the deeper roots contributed to higher yield. So if we can do the same kind of thing in wheat, this would be very useful. But of course it's not the root system doesn't exactly look like what we saw in the first slide, where all of the soil volume is explored uniformly by the root system. In the subsoil in particular, we have these solid block of PEDs in the soil, subsoil, where it's very difficult for the roots to penetrate, and they tend to follow these root pores, soil pores, either made from wormholes or previous root that make channels through the subsoil, and the roots follow through these pores in the subsoil. So what happens is the roots tend to clump together in these pores, which isn't a very efficient way because lots of this other remaining part of the soil volume remains unexplored by the roots. And some of the pores, in fact, are actually quite large diameter, and the root hairs have to stretch to get out to the soil surface in order to pick up water and nutrients. Nevertheless, being able to open up that subsoil with what we call biopores, pores made either from worms or the roots of previous crops, is really important to at least allow the roots to get down into those deeper soil layers. It also helps, of course, the soil drain more freely. So we're exploring ways to introduce more of these biopores into our soils. So that's the story on water. Let's think about nutrients for a moment, another important role of roots. And the uptake of nitrogen, of course, is really key. This figure just shows the well-known negative relationship between grain protein concentration and grain yield. Higher yield you have, the more you dilute protein in the grain. And what we're always trying to do is break this negative relationship. And what this figure shows is that there are some lines that deviate from this general relationship. So within a range of pretty good yield, you have one line there that shows a higher nitrogen protein concentration in grain than the other. So we can ask, what is it about that variety that gives it that advantage? So one question, of course, is it the uptake of nitrogen from the soil solution? Is it the uptake of nitrate? Well, this was looked at, and this, again, is old data, and it shows a set of Argentinian varieties. And if you look in this column, these varieties are much better at uptake, at nitrate uptake from the solution than some of these other varieties. So there is a genetic control over nitrate uptake. But what turns out is that actually all of the varieties are pretty good at taking up nitrate, and it's pretty much determined by the demand of nitrogen from the shoot. So there's a positive relationship between the growth of the roots and the growth and the uptake of nitrate. The same is also true for the growth of the shoot. So the more the plant demands in terms of nitrogen, the more the roots are able to supply to the plant. And just another way of showing this, there's an experiment with Canadian spring wheat, and it shows the ratio of nitrogen uptake to the nitrogen required by the plant. So if that was balanced, you'd have a value of 1. But this shows that the values are quite high, so there's much more capacity to supply or to take up nitrate than the plant actually requires. And the maximum peak of nitrate supply to the plant is matching the maximum demand for nitrate just before flowering. So the bottom line for that is that the plants are actually very good at taking up nitrate. The limitation is what the plant does with it once it's in the root and to get it into the grain. So we mustn't forget about yet another function of the roots, and that's anchoring the plant. So one of the problems of lodging is not only the bending of the stems, but also the lodging at the root plate. And again, the spread of roots is really important in anchoring the plants. So just before, when I said maybe we want a steep root angle to get the root system growing down instead of out, that might have a cost then in terms of lodging. And so we have to always balance the different kinds of demands on the root system. Also, we know that phosphorus is in the upper soil layers, and a root system that goes horizontally and in the upper soil surface layers can scavenge that phosphorus much more efficiently than a root system that is very narrow. So we have to, again, balance those different needs and functions of the root system. So just to summarize then, a healthy, productive plant above ground helps ensure a vigorous root system. Compromise the shoot, and you compromise the root. A healthy soil with good tilth and poor subsoil fosters good root growth and function. So damage the soils, and you'll restrict the roots. Something we all know, but we need to find out ways to improve all the time the way that we're managing the crops. How about the different varieties? Well, we showed in this work that wheat varieties do differ in root activity for water uptake, but the differences between varieties are small. Nevertheless, even those small differences can make a difference to yield, particularly under stress conditions. And finally, wheat roots are very good at taking up nitrogen, but some varieties are better at assimilating and moving that nitrogen to the grain than others. So that gives you a picture of some of the things that are happening in the world of roots for wheat, and hopefully that will stimulate a few questions and comments later. So just to acknowledge the companies we worked with and people who did the work. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. We will keep the questions until the end, if that's okay, if you're okay with that. We're going to move through it. I mean, it's fascinating. For me as an agronomist, I look after 25,000 acres. of land across Lincolnshire, and I carry a spade and digging holes and looking at things and showing people things now, because we've all got very used to making sure what's above the ground looks good, and it's very easy to forget that the only bit that's driving it is the bit that's underground. So I think that's probably something with varietal breeding that'll change over the next few years, hopefully with people like Eric leading the research. So if I could move on then to our next speaker, Ellie Marshall from AHDB, and Ellie will be talking about new initiatives to improve yield and quality. Ellie is the AHDB Research and Knowledge Transfer Manager in Plant Breeding and Genetics for AHDB Cereals and Oilseeds, and she's been with them since 2012. She has a BSc Biology, a PhD in Plant Science. Ellie manages the plant breeding and genetics portfolio and has involvement in recommended list analysis too. So if I could ask Ellie to come up.
Hey, thank you. So I'm going to give you a brief overview this afternoon on some initiatives currently going on in plant and variety development, and particularly how collaboration between industry and the research community can help with this. So first of all, I'm just going to take a brief look at how some of the genetic advances in the past have helped to contribute to the yields that we're achieving on farm today. And then also some of the breeding challenges ahead, which are facing the industry when looking for breeding new varieties. And I'm also going to give a bit of an overview of one of the current projects which is running to give tools for breeders in order to develop new varieties for the future. So first of all, just taking a look at UK wheat production. So over the last 150 years or so, there's been fairly sort of stable wheat production. So over the last 50 years, on-farm yields have increased by a large amount, nearly 4.5 tonnes per hectare. So after World War II, there were slight increases in on-farm yields, perhaps due mainly to farm practice. But one of the major genetic improvements over that time came in the 1970s with the introduction of semi-dwarf varieties. This led to an immediate increase in yield, and also better lodging, and also more developments in quality and disease. And by the 1980s, the UK crop yield was at its peak, where around the same levels as where it is today, and the UK on-farm yields were around 8 tonnes per hectare. But obviously, yield is not the only challenge with breeding new varieties. Over the last 20 years, I haven't seen as significant advances in yield on farm. But that doesn't mean that genetic advances have not been taking place. So breeding for a bread wheat variety is one of the key drivers in the UK market. And quality factors are obviously key for this as well, and not just yield. So that could perhaps be one factor as why advances have not been seen in yields as much. However, we are now starting to see bread wheat varieties which are competitive with feed wheat varieties on yield. So this story could also begin to change. So improvements are continually being made, but there are many challenges ahead. So just a quick overview of some of the challenges facing the industry when looking to breed new varieties. First of all, yield is obviously always going to be a focus and is a key driver of breeding new varieties. Quality, especially when you're looking at a bread wheat variety, is also going to be a key focus. Not only factors such as specific weight, Hagberg falling number and protein, but also perhaps other factors such as the actual functional protein and many specialist qualities as well for looking at those niche markets. Pest and disease is of course always going to be a key target, and there are many targets here with wheat, and minimum standards need to be met to ensure a a successful variety. And of course, agronomy is always going to be important too, to ensure that the crops can be properly managed once on farm. So if these challenges weren't enough already, and you have the correct mix of genetics in your variety to produce a successful variety on yield, quality, and agronomy and pest and disease resistance, the environment is always going to be a challenging factor for this. And varieties need to be resilient against changes in the environment. And then overarching all of this are many other factors which can be out of the industry's control. Factors such as changes in processing or innovations within the industry, and also new threats, perhaps not just new pest and disease threats, but also threats from changes in legislation or building new resistances to current agrochemicals. So this is just a brief overview of some of the challenges for the industry, and varieties being bred today may not even make the growers' field for at least another 10 years. So pre-breeding is an essential part of research to ensure that varieties of the future. The BBSRC and the Scottish Government have funded an initiative which is aimed to help achieve this. So the Crop Improvement Research Club aims to bring together industry and the research community in the support of crop improvement for wheat, barley and oilseed rape. And it uses basic science to address these challenges. It's not only funded by BBSRC and the Scottish Government, but it also has involvement from 14 industry partners, of which AHDB is one of those. And the links between the industry partners and the research community are key in ensuring that the right targets are met. So there are 15 main projects which it supports, and in addition to these, there are also 10 PhD programs too. So the Crop Improvement Research Club focuses on 4 main areas of research. Firstly, looking at higher yields. So yield is obviously a key factor in the development of any new variety. And projects here include looking at the genes which control the function of pod shatter in oilseed rape. The second target for the club is looking at healthier crops. So the loss of actives in genetic improvement does mean that genetic improvement is a very important factor against pest and disease. And there's a project currently looking at novel resistances to turnip yellows virus within this field. Better quality is the third target of the club, as meeting the market requirements is key, as you need to be able to sell your variety once it's been grown. And I'm going to go into a bit more depth on one of those projects just in a moment. And finally, improved roots. So as Eric gave a really great overview on that just a moment ago, it is obviously also important to look underground as well as what's going on with the crop above ground. So the club's been running for nearly 5 years, and practical outputs for breeders are starting to be realised. So one example of this is some work on grain skinning in malting barley, which is currently taking place at SRUC. So grain skinning in barley, it's the partial loss of the husk at the harvest, and it decreases malting efficiencies by influencing the rate, vigour and evenness of the germination. And it does impact the whole supply chain. So growers can lose a premium if their grain's been rejected, and it can also cause processing problems for maltsters, brewers and distillers. So the CIRC project is investigating the causes and control at a genetic level to reduce grain skinning and poor husk adhesion for varieties of the future. So this chart shows a range of varieties which have been analysed, over 200. And the blue bars show lower levels of skinning, and the green, yellow and red show progressively higher levels of skinning in the grain. We see there is quite a spread of the different ranges of skinning, and the red stars indicate varieties which are on the recommended list, and the green triangles are varieties which are brewing varieties. So we see that there is, again, a spread across this spectrum, but there are a number of varieties recommended and also brewing varieties which appear at the poorer end of the spectrum. So one of the questions we ask is skinning related to a trait that is actively selected for? So again, the main aim of this project is to develop tools for breeders to enable them to develop varieties with the lower risk of skinning. So to achieve this, the project's taken a number of different approaches. First of all, it's taken a phenotypic approach in order to identify QTL, so regions of the chromosomes where the trait can be linked to. And subsets of varieties have been taken for more detailed analysis, both phenotypic and also genotypic. Misting conditions were used in experimental conditions to induce skinning in subset of varieties. So these are different varieties here, and you can see the darker bar is under control condition and the lighter bar under misting condition, which actually has induced skinning in most cases. And these differences are important when identifying the physical characteristics of grain skinning and also any genetic differences. So these varieties were taken further to look at some of the physical characteristics. Firstly, grain components were looked at, and to date there's been no significant differences found between the weights and dimensions of those which were susceptible to skinning and those which were not. Adhesion to the husk has been something which more progress has been made. So there's a lipid layer in between the husk and the pericarp, which is the adhesive layer joining the husk to the rest of the grain. And phenotypic studies, microscopic studies, have shown that actually this layer is reduced in varieties which have susceptibility to grain skinning. But we ask if there's a genetic control to this. And a transcriptomics approach has been taken to identify genes which have significant changes in expression levels to see if they are upregulated or downregulated in the skin under skinning conditions. And to date, microarray data has suggested that there are a number of genes per variety where their expression levels differ between the misting and the control conditions. And through a series of validation steps, genes associated with the trait can be identified. So overall, this plan of work is creating tools for breeders to use to develop varieties of the future. Understanding the physical characteristics, any genes involved, are all powerful tools for breeding the newer varieties. And an additional project to follow on from this has been funded by AHDB to understand the effects of crop management and the handling on grain skinning. But this is just one example of some of the work going on within the Crop Improvement Research Club. And we do have this featured on our stand in the atrium, so if you're interested in any of the other projects, please pop along to our stand. So just to summarise, there's been great advances in particularly yield over the last 50 years, but breeders do face many challenges when developing new varieties for the future. And understanding the genetic basis of traits is an important tool for this, as we've just seen in the grain skinning example. And again, knowledge exchange between industry and academia is going to be key to ensure that the varieties meet the needs of the grower for the future. So I just want to say thank you very much for listening, and if you're interested in any more information about the history of plant breeding or any information about the business and the science, we've got some good publications from BSPB on our stand. And also, again, if you want to find out any more information about the Crop Improvement Research Club, we're featuring all of the projects there too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellie. If we'll take, as I said earlier on, we'll take questions at the end from anybody who's left. And no, it's all right. You drive safely. So it just shows we do have variety. We're starting to get what we call dynamic varieties moving through now. We've got varieties like Skyfall, Crusoe. We've got KWS Lily. We've got Trinity. We've got varieties which are... no longer is it just pick one of the top 6, because we're starting to tailor things to higher yield, and yield isn't everything, as you've just heard. It's cost of production, which is the most important bit, I think. But moving on then to our final speaker of the day. And thank you for your attention this afternoon. And it's a change to the programme. It's Anna Lockwood, who's going to give us a wheat market overview to leave you all in good spirits before you get home. Anna graduated from the Royal Agricultural College and has a degree in agricultural management. She joined AHDB Cereals and Oilseeds as an analyst in the market intelligence team, specialising in information supply on grains and oilseeds. She regularly works on Prospects, which is one of the key market information publications, and writes, edits and publishes articles and data as well as price reporting. So over to Anna.
Thank you. As Sean just mentioned, I'm going to finish by giving you a bit of a wheat market overview, which might be slightly depressing, but I'll try and liven it up slightly. So the presentation is basically going to start by giving a bit of a global picture of what's been going on for the grain market, looking at wheat and maize supply and demand. Then going to move on slightly closer to home, see what's been going on the UK market, again looking at supply and demand, prices, and also looking a bit at what's been happening with trade as well. So to begin with, this chart here plots global wheat and coarse grain supply and demand. The blue bars there show production and the black line shows the level of demand. Now, as we come into 2015-16, we're in our third consecutive year of a grain surplus. And this surplus has really been weighing down on global prices, which I'm sure you haven't failed to notice. Now, although this is currently the case, it is important to remember that we are, as ever, only one weather event away in a change in the market direction. So try not to get too complacent about the current situation. So now looking at wheat supply and demand. On this chart here, again, we have production plotted in the bright blue bars, and consumption is the dark blue bars there, with the stocks to use ratio, the red line. Now, after 3 good supply years, our stocks-to-use ratio, or the global stocks-to-use ratio, is up for the 3rd year in a row. Now, these heavy stocks are really weighing down on wheat prices, not only on a global scale, but also just coming back, and it's on the UK market as well. Now, you can see there that production is up, but also it's important to notice that consumption is up. So although we do have this, currently have this large stock and surplus weighing down on the market, with consumption also increasing, there is that increasing pressure being put on farmers to produce these higher yields and levels of production. And as I just said, it would only take, albeit at the moment, a slightly larger weather event to change the direction of the market. With demand increasing, we do need to keep the level of production also increasing. So just now looking at some of the main global wheat producing regions and what's been happening this year. The green text shows the regions that have increased their level of production year on year, and the red shows a decline in production. So the EU there, you can see, is forecast to produce around 157 million tonnes of wheat this year. And if forecasts are realised, that will be a record production level. You can also see that production is forecast to increase year on year in Russia and Ukraine, which again is going to create a lot more competition on the global export market. The US there in red, you can see, is due to decline year on year production. Now, although we are seeing slightly less production there, they can't be written off as big players in the global market and also one of the biggest competitors. Now looking at global maize supply and demand, and it's really important to look at maize when we're talking about wheat, as it's becoming an increasingly dominant grain on the feed grain market. So again, we've got production in light blue, consumption in dark blue, and this stocks to use ratio in red. Now, unlike wheat, maize production is actually forecast to decline slightly year on year. Last year we had a record global crop of over 1 billion tonnes. This year slightly below. Consumption's also slightly lower, as you can see there. Now, the stocks to use ratio is showing on this chart as being slightly higher year on year, but actually before the latest supply and demand estimates were released from the USDA last week, what we actually saw was a declining stocks to use ratio. Now the increase has come due to a revision for the Chinese maize opening stocks, and there was actually less demand than that was previously anticipated for Chinese maize, so the stocks were hiked 20 million tonnes in the last estimates. Now, this has not really done much to change the overall situation of maize supply, although it just gave a little bit of market sentiment when the estimates came out. Now, looking a bit about the maize producing regions, unsurprisingly, you can see that the main regions are largely due to decline the level of production year on year, as overall production is down. The US is probably the key one to look at here. With maize, it's a slightly different situation to wheat, as you can see, there isn't very many large producing and exporting regions. It's a bit of a all your eggs in one basket situation here. The US actually produce around 40% of total global maize production. So that decline there for the US, as you can see, is sort of transpired through to the total decline overall. In Brazil, the decline there is due to farmers switching to soybeans. There's a lot more profitability to be had there rather than growing maize. A bit of an uplift in South Africa, but again, that's not having any major effect on the total outcome. So now looking at what's happened in the global price situation. Here we have Chicago maize plotted. These are nearby futures prices. That bottom line is the maize line. And the top one is the UK feed wheat nearby futures price. You can't help but notice that downward trend since 2013. And then it's moved slightly horizontal for 2015. So what's happened here and why it's so important to look at these two prices together is that wheat and maize are direct competitors on the feed grains market, and they both compete for that feed grain demand. So really that wheat price is governed by the lower maize base price, which is why the whole wheat complex, as we'll discuss in a minute, has been coming down. So moving slightly close to home, looking at the UK situation. We've got UK wheat production and demand here on this chart, with domestic demand, the blue shaded area, and production, the black line there. Now, had a reasonable harvest after 2015. Production slightly down year on year, but we have this large stock surplus, which is helping to cushion that decline. And we've also seen slightly less demand, so year on year that's fallen slightly with less demand and requirements likely to come from millers, distillers, and bioethanol requirements. So looking at UK ex-farm prices now, a really depressing bit. UK bread wheat is this top line in navy blue, and UK feed wheat is the bottom line. And again, it's a sadly rather downward trend since the beginning of 2014 through to 2015. You can also see that the milling wheat premium has been narrowing. We've been seen after harvest this year a bit more higher quality milling wheat available on the market, so with more available, that price has come down. And as we've just previously mentioned, that low maize base price, that's really pulling not only the feed wheat price down, but the whole wheat complex is pulling all of it down. Something slightly more encouraging now, if we look at the forward price carry. So here on this chart we have, as at the 16th of November, the forward price is plotted from November 15 through to November 17. And you can see here that the market is creating this alternative demand, and with higher prices, so looking at just over £130 a tonne for November 2017, creating that incentive for farmers to store rather than to sell wheat at the moment. So now looking at UK wheat quality, we have here the results from the AHDB Cereals and Oilseeds Cereal Quality Survey. And first, if we look at the specific weight, at 78.6 kilograms per hectolitre, it's the highest specific weight we've seen since 2011. The highest region, or the region with the highest results, was also the Midlands region. And with a slightly bigger grain and higher bushel weight, we could be looking at higher flour extraction rates this year for millers, so that's beneficial for them. Looking at Hagberg falling number, slightly lower year on year, 288. It's the lowest Hagberg falling number we've seen since 2012. The average Group 1 Hagberg falling number was 312, again down since last year when we saw the average number being 320. Moving on to protein content, which is a fairly big one. Slightly high year on year at 11.9, but this really remains a limiting factor when looking at the quality of the UK wheat. If we look at the number of proportion of samples that passed NAT full spec milling wheat requirements, the level was only 37%, which really again shows that in comparison the amount of samples that met the Hagberg falling requirements was 90%. So that number there is really showing that protein is again the limiting factor this year. Looking specifically at Skyfall, after it had its first commercial harvest this year, the average protein content was 12.5%. And next year, when we have KWS Lily and Trinity in the mix, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with the protein content, and if these high yielding varieties are going to start a longer term trend of maybe a slightly lower protein content. We'll have to wait for the next harvest to see for that one. I'm now looking at a bit of UK trade and what's been happening. Here we have the early supply and demand balance sheet from AHDB. Full results, or the full balance sheet, can be found on the website. Now, the surplus that the UK has available for exports or stocks this year is 3.6 million tonnes, a fairly large amount, up from last year when we had around 2.9 million tonnes. This attractive forward price carry as well that I've just mentioned is making it slightly less, or giving slightly less of an incentive for farmers to sell, along with lower prices. And then if we look at what's been happening with exports and imports this season, what we've got here is the blue bars plot the level of imports we've had for wheat, barley and maize, and the red bars there show the level of exports. The net trade is plotted on there with the black diamonds. And what you can see is that actually from July to September this year, that's the trade data that we have available so far, the UK has actually remained a net importer despite having this huge surplus of wheat that we need to shift. So that's slightly not so encouraging, and this stocks is really continuing to weigh down on the prices. You can see for barley it's a slightly more positive picture. Really that's because barley exports at the moment we're able to export outside of the EU, which is why we're sort of having more positive luck, a bit more luck there. And now if we look a bit at currency, we can see why. You can see what we have here is the value of the pound in euros, which is the blue line at the bottom, and the value of the pound in US dollars, which is the top line. Now, you can see that relative to the euro, the pound has actually got stronger in recent months, which is why that we're struggling to get our wheat outside of the UK and export into the EU. Now, typically, the UK exports around 2/3 of stocks, of wheat stocks, into the EU, which is why we've probably seen slightly steadier exports at the beginning of this season. Now, relative to the US dollar, the sterling, as you can see, has come a lot weaker recently, which, yes, is beneficial, although if we look at sterling in comparison to its value again, or if we look at sterling's value in comparison to the US dollar, it's weak, but if you look at other key exporting currencies such as the Canadian dollar, the Australian dollar, and the ruble, we are still not weak enough to compete against them in the global market. Which is why we could be seeing these slow exports so far this season. So moving on from that slightly depressing news, if we just look quickly ahead at what's potentially going to be happening for harvest 2016. Here we have plotted on the table the results of the early bird survey from the Anderson Centre. Again, the full results from the survey can be found on the AHDB website. And what we can see here, looking at the areas, is that the wheat area is likely to remain fairly similar year on year. Again, we're going to see a declining oilseed rape area, that's down 14% year on year. And notably, spring barley is also forecast to increase by 10%. So again, looking at a larger area for that spring crops. Again, although these are very good indications of what could happen at harvest 2016, of course, the crops aren't really necessarily in the ground yet, so use more as indicative figures rather than actual what's likely to happen. So just to conclude, after our third consecutive year of a grain surplus, we're really seeing pressure being put on grain prices and wheat prices, not only on a global scale but also on a UK scale. And this large surplus for the UK, as I just mentioned, at 3.6 million tonnes. If it doesn't start to be shifted at a slightly faster rate, we could see further weight being put on domestic grain prices. However, it's really important to remember that all may not be lost. As usual, or as ever, we are only one, albeit slightly fairly detrimental weather event away from a change in the market direction. So, thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Anna. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention. Just to sort of summarise, you start to see the importance of plant breeding and where we are. Eric sort of ran us through the route. We all understand how important the roots are, but it is very, very easy to concentrate on what's above ground level. As agronomists and farmers, that's kind of what we concentrate on, and to understand what's going on underneath and to understand how the root system influences the uptake of all the nutrients, anchoring it in the ground. The only question I would have of Eric would be 2011 and 2015, in my experience, were the best two harvests we've had over the last 6 or 7 years, and yet they were the driest years. and yet where the plants are watered, you get a better root mass. So I think there's far more to it than we understand. It's a whole subject that I don't think we'll ever understand, but it's people like Eric that start to make it easy for us to comprehend and accept how things work. Then we had Ellie Marshall, and it just goes to show once again a massive, massive subject, new initiatives to improve the yields and the quality. And it's fair to say that data that would appear extraneous, and why are we ever going to use that? We've said this before. 10 years ago we would be saying that, and now that data is being used on a daily basis. So the information you've seen today will become far more important and pertinent as we go through the coming years. And Anna, who has the hardest slot, telling us why the price of wheat is where it is. But we all know that. We all know why. We know that in 2012 was when the price went up last, and that was because it was the most horrendously wet year. Yields were absolutely appalling. Therefore, supply and demand comes into play. We have to rely on somebody else having a bad harvest to get the yields up, to get the prices up. We know that. It's not new information, so don't shoot the messenger. She's only telling you how it is. But fascinating for me as an agronomist to see how things are moving. I think we're in for some changes over the next few years. Remember that cost of production is far more important than how much you've yielded. And you will all have neighbours who you will never out-yield them unless you ask them what they yielded first. So don't be blinded by what people are telling you. It's how much you're costing to produce each tonne which is the key, and it's that attention which will keep you in business. And just remember that farming is 80% luck and 20% skill, but if you haven't got the 20%, you shouldn't really be trying it. So with experts like these, in every single session that there's been a lot of good information coming out, a lot of useful information. And for me as an agronomist, you know, it's good to hear that these people are working behind the scenes for us, the plant breeders, the AHDB, everybody's working for us. Just listen to what they're telling you, and we see so far because we stand on the shoulders of giants. So have a very safe journey home, have a very Merry Christmas, and next year you should all come to me. All right, thank you.